Welcome everybody. This is the SharePoint Framework and JavaScript Special Interest Group. It is the bi-weekly sync. It is May 7th, 2020. And this is the Microsoft 365 PnP team presenting the things. And now let's actually move on the slides. We have quite a lot of stuff to actually go through today. So I'm going to keep the intro section hopefully in 15 minutes, and then we have 45 minutes of demos. So we're trying to keep this in that kind of a cycle. But let's see how this goes. Few updates and few updates from Microsoft sites, and then updates on the open source projects, and then we'll go to the demos with Ramin and Joe and Paolo in the end. Really cool stuff actually in the demos today. Quick recap on the updates, opportunities to participate in the PnP SPFx Special Interest Group or in our stuff in general. This actually apply in a lot of the community calls what we're having. We absolutely welcome demonstrations of SharePoint Framework solutions in our SharePoint Framework calls. So it could be a web part application customized in Microsoft Teams tab, Microsoft Teams personal application or something like that, and demonstrate how you build it, what are your learnings, because typically when we build some stuff and develop stuff, we learn new stuff, and it's actually a good thing to share between others as well. And you can definitely share something related on at PnP, which is PnPjs, and a few other things which are underneath our open source efforts. And those are really cool things to demonstrate, because I think that helps some people to understand also the value of these open source projects. If you don't want to do demos, contribute in GitHub is one option as well. Because this way, when you do pull requests as to our documents or to our other things, you actually get credited out of them, and it is visible in your GitHub profile. And all of those things actually matter when people are comparing people, for example, for a job or whatever. So those things actually have a big impact. Report issues is a big thing as well, and the most important thing is provide feedback, so we know what is right, what is wrong, what doesn't work, what is missing. This is super important. Obviously, there is a user voice, but on top of the user voice, it's really, really important to kind of give us the feedback openly in the social media, in the issues and all of that. Also, positive feedback is good. I still remember, I think I mentioned this in some of the community calls. Like 2 weeks back, there was an issue open up in I think it was in the PnPjs, or was it in SP DevDocs, which was just, hey, I just wanted to drop by and say, you guys do an awesome job. And actually, it was really nice to see that everybody in the PnP team got to know and see that in the general channel of our internal team discussion. Everybody was like, wow, finally somebody actually openly says positive feedback, because 99%, unfortunately, of the issues and input and feedback is always negative. So let's try to grow the community also on this positive feelings, because those things do matter. When we behave positively, it generates positivity, and then everybody has much more nicer to work together as well. Now, moving on things. Quick recap on the URLs and everything. A lot of you have seen these already. We tend to repeat them in a lot of the community calls, but they came as M365 PnP videos. The recording of this call goes there as well in 24 hours. We have a lot of open source stuff, which I'm going to actually mention more detailed in the following slide, because we did some shuffling again on the open source side related on github.com/SharePoint, github.com/PnP. AKMS SPFx is the SharePoint framework location for developing SharePoint framework solutions for SharePoint or for Microsoft Teams. And then AKMS SPFx web parts, AKMS SPFx extensions for the samples, and AKMS SP dev issues for the issues which you run into even though you wouldn't have a primary support in your site. Now, one of the things which we did, actually, we finalized this transition earlier today, which is that all of the open source, let's say, initiatives and samples which have been contributed by the community are now located in the PnP organization. And one of the reasons why we wanted to do this is that there's a clear kind of a differentiation on which organization in GitHub is owned by the engineering and Microsoft rather than owned by the community with co-ownership with Microsoft. So there's a clear kind of a differentiation on SLAs and assumption on what's going to happen inside of organization as well. So a lot of the samples, like the sample galleries and solutions and all of that, are now in the github.com/PnP rather than in the github.com/SharePoint. One of the reasons why we also wanted to do this is that a lot of the SharePoint framework samples nowadays actually are related on personal applications in Microsoft Teams and Teams tabs. So it's not about SharePoint, it's about Microsoft Teams. So keeping them under the SharePoint organization doesn't really make any sense. So that's why we have the PnP organization, which is more generic for cross Microsoft 365 areas. Now, we have a lot of samples. We have a lot of libraries and open source initiative under the PnP umbrella, and we are super excited to announce our new landing page designed together with some of our Microsoft designers. And this really cool site. Thank you also for David and Hugo for helping up setting up the HTML structures and content in here. But basically, there's 3 URLs. All of those are pointing on the same location and redirected to the same location. But it's a one URL where you can actually find all of the different community calls, guidance, reusable open source samples and solutions, and SDKs and tools. So it should be helping you actually to find what's available rather than re-implementing a wheel time after time after time, because actually there's quite a lot of samples available. We're talking more than 500 samples under the umbrella of the PnP or the Microsoft 365 PnP, which is pretty cool. Rather, you take a look on the sample and then adapt that to your own needs rather than implementing from scratch. Now, quick also advertisement for next Tuesday. Next Tuesday, we have a SharePoint monthly community call where we cover the latest on user voice community contributions and all of that. So who has actually contributed to our open source initiative within the last month. And one of the things with the monthly community calls is that we tend to actually get more and more also non-dev topics here. That's by design because our non-dev people are getting jealous about the community engagement what we're having here. So in the monthly calls, we're kind of concentrating more on the features and functionalities. And this time in the monthly community call for SharePoint, we have a securing your data in SharePoint OneDrive Teams with sensitivity labels. Sesha is going to touch also API surface, but it will not be the primary purpose of this functionality as well. But if you're looking into understanding what are those, what is the opportunities even for partners related on that, it's a good call on next Tuesday. Also wanted to promote the lap around Microsoft Graph initiative, which is basically a 7 articles, blog post articles, which are all out. I think Hugo, Fabio, Simon Okren, and Cameron Trier were the MVPs behind of this, and then a few engineers from the Microsoft Graph side. So really cool set on how to take advantage of Microsoft Graph Toolkit, either in the SharePoint Framework solutions or in a single page application hosted outside of the SharePoint in Azure application or in AWS or whatever is your chosen path. Now, quick recap on the SharePoint framework. I'm going to be super fast. This is almost like an advertisement again. We had this one last time as well, but pretty recently we recorded a nice video if you're interested on this model, how to build a multi-tab Microsoft Dams personal application with SharePoint framework. And it really concentrates on explaining how you can build a multi-tab personal application for Microsoft Teams using SharePoint framework. So a complex solution there. And that's available in our YouTube channel. On SharePoint Framework side, nothing really dramatic has changed for the past months. So to say 1.10 is still the latest version, which is out. We're still kind of let's say regrouping ourselves after COVID-19 and what is the focus areas which we're going to ship next. We have a lot of stuff in the roadmap, a lot of stuff ready to go, but we need to repackage some of that stuff as well. The SharePoint Framework support in App Store is coming really soon, or it's going to be announced really soon, and then availability details will be announced together with that announcement. Also, we have quite a few virtual conferences coming up pretty soon where it will be actually talked about. And Teams integration is definitely one of the primary areas for SharePoint Framework in the future as well. So you'll see improvements in here. Other than that, really not dramatic changes. We're looking into having more extensions for SharePoint portals, but no details on that one at this point. Now, PnPjs, Patrick is on a family leave, so I'm going to quickly recap this one. So the 2.05 is coming up on the 8th of May. So that's not 5th of August for the non-US based people like it should be. But anyway, yeah, that's a conflicting terminology always. Why can't we have one way of saying dates? Okay, never mind. The new statement of polyfills, which will come out on 8th of May as well. And there's a lot of great feedback related on this one. David Warner did a pretty recently good video related on understanding extension methods in the PnPjs v2. And Patrick is heading back on the family leave. So he has now a second baby, which pretty recently came, and he came back for a few weeks, and now he's back on the family leave. And during this time, then Julie, Andrew, and the team in general is handling things behind of the in the GitHub as well. Now, Office 365 CLI. I think, Gary, you're on the call to go unmuted and quickly do a summary on this one.
Yeah, thanks, Vesa. So hello, everyone. My name's Gary Trinder, member of the Office 365 CLI team with Waldeck Mastercars, Velin Georgiev and AppyShot. So this week, we've just released a preview version of the CLI version 2.10. So we've added some functionality in for managing Yammer users, adding and removing them from groups, improving the externalizing of your SharePoint framework dependencies, and also more improvements to the project upgrade commands as well. A new command we've recently added is installing a Microsoft Teams app for a single user. And we've also added more sample scripts, one being the latest, a report to grab an inventory of flows in your environment. So you can install that by using the npm install at pnp/office365-CLI app next. And if you'd like to know more about the CLI and how to get started, please do visit the website at aka.ms/o365CLI. If you want to keep up to date with all the latest releases and updates, then please follow us on Twitter at Office365CLI and use the hashtag Office365CLI if you do tweet about us. If you've got any ideas or suggestions for new commands and enhancements, or just provide general feedback to the community, we'd love to hear from you. Please do get in touch with us at our GitHub discussions forum at github.com/PnP/Office365-CLI/discussions. And if you are looking for an open source project that you'd like to contribute to, we've currently got 22 open issues that are labeled Good First Issue, so ideal for new starters. We would absolutely love it if you would like to spend your time contributing to our project. Thank you very much.
Good advertisement, Gary, on that one. And by the way, if you're interested on the GitHub discussions, so like Gary mentioned, the PnP Office 365 CLI is in the preview program, so you can actually go to their GitHub and have a look on how the discussions actually work in the GitHub if you're not familiar. And that is the preview feature for now, unless we announced it yesterday. No, I don't think we did it GA yet yesterday in the big GitHub event. Anyway, moving on other quick recap on the open source project SPFx Reusable Components. So there was a new version coming out earlier today, 1.18 for the React controls and 1.18 for the React property controls. And these are basically React-based controls which are using Office UI Fabric behind the scenes, but they are context aware. So as an example, the property field view picker, you do not have to provide the insights of the structures and which views. You just put it on the property pane and say connect to this list, and after that everything will work automatically. So you as a developer, you don't have to worry about the data structures and how things work. As an example, the folder picker control under the React controls, you just associate that control to a document library, and behind the scenes that control is smart enough to call and figure out what are the folders and what are the things and how to make things happen. So really, really usable controls, which are helping a lot to improve the productivity. More information in the URLs, which you can see actually over there, which have been actually changed, but those will be redirected because now that we moved these also to the PnP organization, there was a small change on the URLs, but the URLs will be redirecting properly to the new location as well. Now, PnP SPFx Community Yeoman Generator, nothing new really here, no new development since 2 weeks ago, but the team would be really interested in getting your feedback, what is needed. Are you building your stuff using React? What about Angular? What about Babylon.js? Are you interested on these things? Because this is basically intended to be the open source community-driven SPFx generator, which extends the out-of-the-box generator to make your life easier. And then the question is, how can we make your life easier? And that's really the key point here. But it already supports multiple different things, and Angular 9.0 support in planning. Have a look on and test it out and give us feedback on what's actually needed in here. And then I think Hugo will do the PnP SPFx samples, a lot of new stuff here as well. People seem to have more time to do coding, which is really cool.
Yeah, I love it. So we have a lot of extensions. I'm actually going to need to start making the font smaller. We have 3 new extensions. One that allows you to hide commands from command bar. It's not something that we recommend and that we would support, but we understand the reality is people actually need sometimes to be able to hide some commands. So Russell has a sample, again, not recommended because it could break at any time. We have an application alert message from Sudarshan that displays alerts based on a list. And then we have, and that's going to be demoed on July 2nd. And we have the Advanced App Insight, also from Sudarshan, which allows you to connect to Azure App Insights to get some details about page views and things like that. On the web part side, we have a whole bunch of new samples. One, again, from Sudarshan. We're going to need a slide just for Sudarshan that allows you to determine which user profile properties can synchronize from Azure AD or your own external store to synchronize to the SharePoint user profile service using property import. That's going to be demoed on June 4th. We also have the Teams personal apps from Alex Terentiev, who will be demoing this on June 18th, so I don't want to steal his thunder. We have another one from Siddharth that allows you to add JavaScript and CSS references. Again, this is something that we don't necessarily recommend or encourage because you shouldn't be modifying CSS on a page, but there are some times where you need to do something, insert some JavaScript and CSS, and this is a good approach to do this. And it actually has a user interface that makes it easy for you to do so. Ashok created a frequently asked question web part that pulls the data from a list. And then we have a new version of the adaptive card viewer web part that I had created. Paul Schaeflin actually took the web part and converted it into a React hooks version. So if you look at my original sample, which is using React classes, and Paul's version, which is using React hook, it's a good way to understand what's the difference between the two. Paul will be demoing this on June 18th. And then we have to do a web part with Vue.js. It's one of the original web part samples that we had in the repo. It's now been updated to use SPFx 1.10. We have also my personal apps that Zach Roberts updated. This was original web part from Joao Mendes. And Harsha updated Dimcho Tsanov's web part sample, which allows you to show documents in a library and show details about a document. Bo George has a web, we're almost done. Bo George has a pages history web part, which allows you to create kind of a fake page hierarchy. And he's going to be demoing this on July 2nd. And finally, Paolo, David Warner, and I updated the content query web part to SPFx 1.10, and we're going to be seeing a demo of that today. Thank you, everyone, for your contributions. That's it for me, Vesa.
Yeah, it's amazing how many new samples are coming in nowadays, which is obviously great because they help other people to then achieve the business objectives which they might have. Even though the scenario might not be exactly the same, it gives an indication of how to get moving. I want to address one question from Paul Bullock on the messaging or the chat. There was a question related on any news on Spaces, SharePoint Spaces and SPFx Story. The third party, the SPFx Story for SharePoint Spaces is not yet available. So even though SharePoint Spaces is in preview, so you can actually create content related on SharePoint Spaces controls and the 3D mapping, which doesn't, by the way, require any headsets or anything, and you cannot extend that with an SPFx solution. That's still in the roadmap in the future. Now, let's actually move into the demo section, and we'll start with Ramin, related on a React Yammer Praise web port, which is actually also Microsoft Teams tab or personal application, unless I'm completely mistaken. Ramin?
Hey everyone, hope you and your family are healthy and safe during these uncertain times. So today I'm going to show you a demo how we can post a praise to Yammer. So in content and code, we use Yammer praise to basically motivate our colleagues. And I thought it's a good idea to have a web part that we can just post the praise from SharePoint or within Teams. But before I show you the UI, I just want to show you different ways of communicating with the Yammer API. So there's already a sample in repo you can find, a React Yammer API. So basically it uses Yammer JavaScript SDK to communicate with the Yammer API. So for using this this sample, you need to create an application with Yammer. And after that, you can get the client ID and client secret, and also the redirect URI, and you can keep them in your web part. And after that, by adding the SDK into the page, here you can just call whatever you want. You can get the status of the current user, and also if the user is not logged in or signed in, you can use an iframe to basically go through the OS flow to get the app authorized, and then you can just communicate with the Yammer API. But I had some problems with this approach, and first of all, you need to keep the client ID and the redirect URL somewhere in your web part. And if you want to deploy it to different environments, you have to change and update the client ID and the redirect URI. And second, it's right. I think it's not a good idea to ask the users again to log in to the page because they're already signed into Office 365. And I thought, okay, it might be a better way to do this. And actually, we have really easier way to do that. So we can achieve that and get the token with AAD token provider class. So this class allows you to obtain OS2 tokens from Azure AD, and also helps you to authenticate the user from the SharePoint page to other services such as Yammer, Exchange, Power BI, etc. And the only thing you need to do is pulling this piece of code to your init function. So yeah, with this get token method, you can request an access to a resource, which is Yammer in this example, and it returns the token if the user that's currently logged in has access to that resource. And once you get the token, you can just easily communicate with Yammer API. But to be able to access this resource, you need to go to the app registration. That basically you have two options. You can have your own app registration, or you can just open the SharePoint Online app registration, add a permission to Yammer, and there's only one option available now, which is in preview, user impersonation. And after adding that and grant admin consent for that resource, you are able to basically get the token from SharePoint Framework web part. But before I just explain some of this code, let me just do a really quick overview of this UI. So this is the web part. You can search for people. Add a message. You can select a group from Yammer and select an icon, and you can see a preview of that post in Yammer. And after clicking the post, going to send it to Yammer, and by clicking on this link, you can see that post in Yammer. So if we go back to the code, so here are the token that we got in the previous from here, basically on init function. And for posting the praise, you can just communicate with this endpoint, message.json. And what you need is just a comment, icon, and the user ID. And to get the user ID, you can just call this function. And by passing the email address of the user, you can get the user ID. And here is the method to get the Yammer groups, basically. And also, here's the web part code. I tried to use React hooks in this example. which are, I think, really great because it just make your code really readable, and it's all function components basically. And here's the people picker, which comes from SPFx Controls React. You can just install this library, and it's really easy to use these controls. And that's it. I think it's really easy to just use this approach to get the token. It helps you a lot. I'm sure most people here just aware of AAD HTTP client that is really useful to communicate with some of the resources like Graph API. But sometimes it's not easy to get access to some of the resources, which Yammer is one of them. And I think this is the class that you can use to get access to Yammer, Exchange, Power BI, or some of the resources that is not easy to have them with the AAD HTTP client. And also for basically adding this to, or installing this to into Microsoft Teams, you can just easily open the manifest file, add your hosted, supported hosted like Teams tab and Teams personal app. And when you deploy your code to App Catalog, you can just select your solution. And by clicking on Sync to Teams, it just easily add your application to the Teams. And when you open Teams, you can go to Apps. And if you click on Build for your tenants, it just show you this web part. And by clicking that, you can add it to your personal tabs, or you can add it to a existing Microsoft existing team as a tab. And as you can see, it's just the same UI you can use here. And here is it. You can just post a praise from also Microsoft Teams. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Excellent. Thank you, Ramin. Thank you. It's a nice, really clean implementation, and looks polished. You have even the nice looking logos on the team side for the manifest and all of that. So really nice job. And well, some people like Yammer, some people use Yammer, some people don't. But those organizations which use it widely for community purposes, and this is really, really useful, definitely for them to take advantage as well. So thank you, Ramin, for that one. Now, Joel, I think you are next on the list.
So this is going to be a very quick demo because this is very simple. There isn't much to show.
Joel, come on, concentrate. It's not a great way of starting presentation. It's
no,
awesome.
Because you will see that the advantage is the PnP controls.
No, but true. That's fair point as well. But it is actually a pretty nice way of demonstrating the usage of the controls, and the functionality is pretty cool. So thank you, Joel, for that. Take it away.
So I'm a SharePoint developer who work remotely for Storm, a company based in Dublin. If you want to follow my blog or on Twitter, feel free, you have the details there. So why this simple extension? We did a migration for a client who just loved folders. They had a shared drive with thousands and hundreds of thousands of folders there. We did manage to convert some of that structure into metadata when migrating to SharePoint, but there was a lot of things there that they wanted to keep exactly as it was because it related to other business processes they had. And the whole teams were just used to work in that way, and that was not for discussion. And so when we migrated to SharePoint, the first complaint we had from users was that they could not find the folders they wanted unless they will just scroll forever on a document library, because we're talking about 2,000-3,000 documents per level, and sometimes, folders per level, sometimes 5, 6, 7 levels deep. So as you can imagine, that's a lot of scrolling. So I have a document library here with 2,000 folders. If I want to go to folder like 400, as you can imagine, we load 30 items at a time, and I will be here for a while. We can also go here and use the search box, but actually in this example, it showed what I wanted to show you. It just couldn't find it. And even though the search is great, it doesn't always give you what you want when for example, if you have naming conventions which are very similar between items, which was their case. So the search was not very useful. So we built a simple extension that we deploy to every library. You click here. It uses PnPjs, of course, to load all the folders, and it's super fast. So this is 2,000 folders being loaded, and it takes 2 seconds. And then the only thing we had was, and you can also come here and scroll super fast, because why wouldn't? The only thing we had was basically a filter box. I go to folder 400, and then if there was more folders here, I can show you. We'll just keep loading the 3, and you can go back and forward using the breadcrumb and then selection. And it just simply allows you to go straight to that folder. This might sound very simple, but it was a massive time saver for them, and definitely would be for other people. So I asked them for permission to share the code, and the solution is now available on the samples gallery for extensions. Go there and do whatever you want with it. I'll show you the code. It's super simple. I also wrote a very simple blog post where I have a demo here. If you can have a look, why some of the reasons. And I will show you this one in a second. So let me show you the code. So the extension itself is on the execute. We show a panel, which is basically a custom component we have here, and pass it some properties. Basically, what is the root folder we are exploring, and the default folder in this case was the same, but we could open the file explorer in a different default location if we wanted to. And on our custom panel, we basically have a panel, the folder explorer, and the buttons. So when you select a folder, we put that folder in state. If you click on the Go To, we just redirect you to that folder. That's simple as that. Of course, there was more code here when I first created it, which was the logic to load folders and go back and forward on the breadcrumb, and a few more things like if I go here, you can also, actually not in this one because it's disabled, I think. Yeah, so you also have the option to create a new folder by switching a property to true. But all the logic is now wrapped in a reusable control. So I extracted that control, submitted to the PnP Reusable Controls, which is, oops, wrong one. There. So it's very easy to use. You can have information here if you want to do something else. This was also the control that was just released on a few previous slides on the call. So that control just uses the same, uses the folder explorer to just add a picker around it. So just reusing the same thing again here. And I created a copy and move extension, which also uses this control to copy between different SharePoint locations or OneDrive. So if you have similar needs that use the folder structure a lot, feel free to go and get it. That's me, Vesa.
Now, Joel, can we go one more time, the process, can we go to the folder, and then the reason why, don't downplay your demo, because the reason why this is really cool is that this is really polished a sample addressing a real customer scenario. And sure, it is taking advantage of SharePoint framework and those extension points, but it's really polished. The jumper folder looks right like it should be, right next to the other buttons. It opens up the panel like a lot of the out-of-the-box experiences as well. And this basically is one of those things with a lot of the developers are still looking into how could I do this in a polite and a nice, let's say in a polished way. So having a sample which, yes, from a implementation perspective might be simple. It really demonstrates the simplicity of this model, and then people can adapt. Oh, this is how I do panels, and this is how I actually return to values. So therefore, really great demo. So really cool stuff.
So this takes just a small amount of time to create, and it's a massive time saver and for the company because the people just don't waste time navigating around.
Yeah.
So it's a good investment.
And it's a really good example of why SharePoint framework is really powerful, because now we save time from the customer. And obviously Microsoft will probably never implement this kind of things by natively, because that's not a typical use case. But then for this particular customer, it makes perfect sense. So having those extensibility points even in buttons and menus makes a lot of sense. But thank you, Joel, for that one. A lot of good feedback also on the chat. So really great stuff.
Thank you. If someone has any questions, I will go to the chat now.
Excellent. Thanks, Joel. So next on the line, Paolo.
And so, hello everybody. And now we're going to talk about the modern content by query web part that has been updated in the last few weeks. In fact, the modern content query by web part is something that we already introduced in the SPFx web part repository, now under the PnP organization, I think quite a while ago, something like 2 years ago. But in the last few weeks, we, and when I say we, I mean me, David Warner, and Hugo Bernier, updated the web part to SharePoint Framework 1.10. We decided to keep support for SharePoint on-premises, which was there at the beginning, but now you have in the solution folder an on-prem folder where you can find the old version of the web part, and in the online one, you will find the new one with the SharePoint Framework 1.10 support and all the new capabilities that we introduced. One of the new capabilities that we introduced is the dynamic data support, which will be the main topic of my demo today. So first of all, let me show you in action the web part so that you can see what are the new capabilities, and then I will switch to the code base and explain you how we implemented those functionalities. So here I have the workbench in SharePoint Online, and first of all, I will add the content query web part to my workbench. This is the web part that you have in GitHub. And first of all, we need to configure the content by query web part in order to target a data source. So click on configure, and you can already see if you already know what was the behavior and the UI of the previous version of the modern content query web part, that now the UI is of the property pane is collapsible. Instead of having a multi-step wizard, we just have all of the properties in a unique property pane with a collapsible UI. I can select a source site for my content query web part, and for example, I have a site with some sample news somewhere here. Let me see if I'm lucky enough to find it. Sample news site, here it is. I will target the root of my site, and I will target the site pages of my site, for example, of my target site. Then I really don't care right now to define filtering or sorting criteria. I just want to show you the output and how you can leverage the dynamic data capability. So let me just close this one and let me focus on the layout section. Here you can choose what are the fields to show. So for example, let's say that I want to select the created field of every single item, and that I want, for example, to select the title. And as you can see on the left side on the screen in the actual web part, I see an out-of-the-box output for my content. And actually, let me refresh the source, the data source, because I'm not targeting the right site, I see, because I just see one news and I should have 3 or 4 news in the real demo site. So let me choose again the fields. Sorry about that. So the created field, for example, and now I have 4 news, and the title field. So by doing that, under the cover, the modern content by query web part is building an handlebar template, which you can see by clicking on the edit template content right here. And you can see this is the handlebar template that has been built out of the box by the web part for you. Of course, you can customize the output and the layout of the template, but you can have an out-of-the-box one that you can just customize instead of writing everything from scratch. Now, the interesting part of the story related to the dynamic data part is that now you can create your own custom web parts, and you can connect those custom web parts to the content query web part, and you will be able to make available to your custom web parts any selected item in the UI of the content by query web part. How you can do that? Well, first of all, you can click on a button called Configure Item Selector, and by doing that, as you can see in the UI now, we have still in the template. So from a design perspective, it is not the best ever UI, I know, but you can work on it customizing your template. But now we have, for every single item in the output, we have the ID field, which is a mandatory field, at least under the cover of the template, because we need to identify an item by ID. And we have a select button, which is the button in the out-of-the-box template, but can be whatever you like in your own design template. In fact, this select button, if we click again in the edit template content, is nothing more than an HTML tag with a specific CSS class called select item, and with a data attribute, which will be the attribute to specify the item ID of the item that we want to select. So basically, you can create whatever HTML tag you like, as long as you will provide a CSS class name called select item, and you will provide a data-item attribute with a value, which will be the value of the ID of every single item in the output list. You will be able to leverage that HTML tag, a button in my example, to select an item. You can use, for example, an image or whatever else. Once you have done that, you can add to the page another web part, whatever web part you like, and you can build your own web part, which is what I did in my sample. So this content query consumer web part is another web part completely different in a different solution, which will be connected, which will be bound to the content query web part using the dynamic data functionality of SharePoint framework. How can we do that? Well, if the web part that you build is configured to being able to consume an external dynamic data source, in the property pane of the web part, you can connect the web part to a source. By doing that, you can select to use the content query web part as the data source. You can select to use the selected item in the content query web part as the source for your web part, and you can select the information provided by the content query web part. In fact, whenever there is a selected item, the content query web part will provide to all of the subscribers the web URL of the website in which the item is, the list ID, and the item ID of the selected item, so that you can easily go to the UI, select an item, and as you can see here, by clicking on the select button, the external web part will be in sync with my content query web part and will get the selected item in its own UI. Of course, the consumer web part can be something that you build to provide, just to make an example, an edit UI or a custom detailed view of the content selected in the content query web part, or whatever else you like to do. So that's the goal, that's the result. Now let's move to the code base and let's see how we implemented this functionality. So first of all, let me show you the source code of the content by query web part, the renewed one. This is a SharePoint framework web part, and here I implemented the iDynamic Data Callables interface, which is provided out of the box by SharePoint framework. By implementing this interface, we provide all of the infrastructure, all of the plumbing that we need to make this web part as a dynamic data provider. Once you do that, you have to register your web part as a data provider. So in the onInit method of my web part, I initialize with the dynamic data source manager property of the context of SharePoint framework, this web part as a data source for dynamic data. And just for the sake of having a predefined, pre-selected item, I define a dummy item, which will not have any URL, any list ID, or any item. Will be a -1 item ID. Up to you. Once you have done that, well, you have to implement the actual behavior of the interface. So first of all, you will have to implement the get. Let me go there because it's quite a long source code base. Let me go to the end of the source code. You have to implement the get property definitions, which will be a method defining the interface that we implemented. And using this method, we declare what is the dynamic, or what are the dynamic properties that we want to provide to any external consumer. In our scenario, it will be a property called selected item from a title perspective with an internal ID of name selected item. Moreover, with the get property value method, we declare what is the value, we provide the value of the actual selected item in our scenario. So whenever a consumer, which is bound to our source web part, will ask to have a value, to have the current value of the selected item, will invoke this method, providing the ID of the property, of the dynamic property that the consumer web part wants to read. And if the property ID is the one we are providing, which is selected item, we will simply return back the actual value that we have in the selected item property, in the selected item field that we have in our web part. How do we set this value? Well, we have an event method, which is the onSelected item, which will receive as an input the selected item as a dynamic item, which is a custom interface that we defined. Whenever we get a new item to select, we simply set the value in our internal field, and we notify all of the consumers that the property with ID selected item is changed, so that any subscriber will get a notification and will be able to get the new selected value for our item. Moreover, in the render method of my web part, let me go there, in the render method where we create the React component that will do the actual rendering, we provide a hook to that event handler so that from the React side of the world, we can fire this event and notify all of the subscribers. So this is the dynamic item interface that we define, and which will simply provide the web URL, the list ID, and the item ID that we saw previously in the UI of the dynamic data web part. And we also defined in the properties of the React component that we have the onSelected item method that we want to provide to the React component. Inside the React component, we simply have the logic to bind the handlebars template and the output of the handlebars template to the event listener for the selected item event. How do we do that? Well, let me go to the very end of this component. And here, oops, we have the bind item selectors method. What do we do with this method? Well, this method will be executed whenever we process the handlebar template. So whenever we create the output, the rendering of the output of the handlebars template, then we will invoke this method. This method, we will simply look for all of the HTML elements with the select item CSS class applied to them, as I told you. And if any, will connect the click event to our custom function called item selector click. In the item selector click, we create a dynamic item object instance, and we provide it to the onSelected item of our web part, so that the web part will be able to notify all of the subscribers with the new selected item. And of course, to get the item ID, we simply read the data-item ID attribute. So, from a data provider point of view, that's the story. From a data consumer point of view, let me switch to the other solution, which is a completely different SharePoint framework solution, because you will be able to create your own consumer web part. Here we simply have a client-side web part built with SharePoint framework still. In the properties of the web part, I declared a bunch of dynamic property of the members, and the dynamic property is a type provided out of the box by SharePoint framework, as you can see here. When I have one or more dynamic properties in the properties of a web part, I can then bind them to a data source. Here, in the render method of the consumer web part, whenever I want to access the value of the properties, I need to try to get the source to see if the property is connected to a data source. And if it is connected, okay. If not, I will have to configure my web part. And once I have the properties connected, I will simply provide those dynamic properties to the React component rendering my web part. And in there, I will say try get value to try to get the value from my data source. And if any, this is a very simple consumer web part. I simply show the values in the output. The interesting part of the story in the consumer web part is how we implement the binding UI. So what we need to do in order to connect the data consumer with the data provider. And here is how we do that. Well, first of all, in the properties metadata method of the web part, we declare what is the data type that we expect for all of the dynamic properties that we have in our client-side web part. Moreover, in the get property pane configuration method, we declare a group of settings configurable through the property pane, and in there we declare two possible options. One option is to manually provide the value for those properties using the classic property pane controls. So we can configure the web URL, the list ID, and the item ID through a property pane text field. But we also configure an alternative solution, which is based on a property pane dynamic field set, which is another control provided by SharePoint framework. And inside this property pane dynamic field set control, we define a set of property pane dynamic field objects. Those property pane dynamic field objects allow us to have in the property pane UI the correct behavior to bind my dynamic properties to the properties provided by the data source. And that's why here I'm binding the web URL, the list ID, and the item ID dynamic properties to the target source. Whenever I do that, I also declare that I want to show the secondary group, so the one based on the dynamic binding UI, if and only if I have the properties connected and configured. So I will show the binding UI if that is the case, or I will show the, let me say, out-of-the-box text boxes if I'm not connected to any external data source. So by doing that, I will be able to get in the property pane the dynamic connection to the data source for my web part, and in the render method, I will be able to verify if I'm connected, and if I'm connected, I will be able to get the value inside the consumer web part, and I will be able to render my actual content based on the selected item in the content query web part. Right now, in GitHub, we have the whole source code of the content by query web part. Most likely, after some makeup and code improvements, it would be worth sharing also the reference code for the consumer web part, maybe just in a subfolder here called consumer web part or something like that, so that you will be able to start from there to build your own consumer web part. But the overall idea is that you can use with SPFx 1.10 the new modern content query web part, and if you need, you can also dynamically select the items in the content query web part and consequently update the UI of your own custom developed client-side web part. And I think that's it for me as well, Vesa.
Now, I have two questions. Don't stop sharing it. There was a good question from a chat window related on, so this is a live query of the data. It's not search-based query, right?
Yeah.
When you're presenting the data, it is actually doing live query against the REST APIs. So it's not a search-based presentation. Yeah, that was one of the differences between the search web parts, the PnP search web parts versus this one. So this is a really mimicking the classic content by query web part from technical implementation perspective.
Yeah.
The other thing, which is just a nuance again on this one. So I think there was a picture of this one also in Microsoft Teams. So you could easily then surface your, let's say, Teams, Microsoft, portal news into Teams by using this kind of a web part as well, if that's something what you want to do. So because this has access on the Microsoft 365 and all of the sites and all of the content within your SharePoint data structure, so you can easily surface then data using this configuration. Really, really cool. Really cool stuff. So we're running out of time, so let me share my screen just to close up for today. So really great demos from everybody, from Ramin and Joel and Paula. And we are surprisingly exactly on the time as well. Now, quick recap on what's happening up next. So the recording will be available within 24 hours in a Microsoft 365 SharePoint community YouTube channel, AKMS M365 PnP videos. 25, there's already 15,600 subscribers on that one, and new videos coming up on there every single day. There's going to be more and more videos in the future. There's multiple MVPs now actually creating videos to this channel as well, which is really, really cool. Follow us on Twitter if you want to stay up to date on whenever stuff gets released as a blog post or as a video or as a guidance. If you follow up us on the Twitter, that's the easiest way to actually get up to date on when there's something new, if you're using Twitter. If you're not, YouTube is probably the easiest way to do that. Next SPFx call is on May 21st. Next M365 general dev call is on May 14th, so a week from now. And then the monthly call is next Tuesday. On Tuesday's call, we're going to talk about the latest on the sensitivity labels in Microsoft 365 as the demo. It is a really cool demo, by the way, of understanding the capabilities. On M365 general dev call, we're going to talk about actually Microsoft Teams provisioning and also using Yo Teams to create Microsoft Teams solutions which are running in SharePoint, which is a pretty interesting scenario from Victor Villain. So a lot of new stuff coming on next week as well. Here's a quick list on all of the different URLs to get access on all of the different community calls which we're running. There's quite a lot of them. All of these are getting recorded. All of those are available then as a recording afterwards. So you don't have to be explicitly on the call if you don't want to. One of the main advantages of being in the call is definitely the meeting chat. And I think it's getting more and more reliable for everybody getting able to see that as well. It's unfortunately not recorded in the recording because that would be even better. But anyway, so that's the benefit of the live calls. So quite a few different calls happening, and AKMS M365 dev calls is the URL to get access on all of them. No time for Q&A today. We had an awesome audience today, awesome demos. Thank you everybody for being a part of this. Thank you everybody who's contributing. The monthly summaries, everything else goes live again on next week. And thank you for the demo presenters today. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Let's stay positive and share positive feedback for our families and friends and colleagues and everybody else. Thank you. Bye-bye.